Welcome, everybody. I think I'm just going to go ahead and get started because I want to respect everybody's time. And it is sure nice to be here. We almost didn't make it, but we got it all taken care of thanks to the wonderful people at IT. So again, hello and welcome. I'm so grateful you're here with us, taking time out of your lives this afternoon for our presentation on DACA and the presidential election, which is coming up in 18 days, but who's counting? My name is Maria Chavez, and I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science here at PLU. And like I said, it's a big honor to speak with you today, and I'm so glad it happened.
Hi, everyone. Also super excited to be here. My name is Wendy Martinez Hurtado. I'm a second-year law school student at the University of Washington. Again, really excited to be here and join you all in this conversation.
Great. Thank you, Wendy. So what we're going to do is I'm going to speak to the point of how we got to having an estimated 3.6 million undocumented people raised in the US without legal rights or representation. And following this, I'll provide a brief overview of some of the main findings from my own research in this area. I wrote a book about it in 2015, and Wendy was actually my RA for the book and a participant as well. After I give that contextual background, Wendy will share her own personal story and the impact DACA has had on her life. And following this, I will discuss the significance of this presidential election. Then we'll conclude with about 15 minutes of Q&A. So if you have questions, please post them on the Q&A tab, and then we will get to them at the end. We'll stop sharing the slides and we will address your questions. But before I begin, and maybe this is perhaps why we had a security issue with this presentation, I need to state up front that our comments will not force a discussion of both sides of this issue. Why? Because DACA is about people brought to this country as children through no say or fault of their own and who were then raised in this country. So this is no more a both sides issue than pretending there are two sides to a discussion of why close to 20% of children in the US live in poverty. A two-sided analysis falsely legitimizes the minority of critics of DACA. Unless, as one of my colleagues stated, the two sides I discuss are about right and wrong. That said, I fully understand that there are many complexities to other aspects of immigration, such as policies around sanctuary cities, asylum questions. Those are debatable, difficult topics, but I don't think similar debates apply to DACA. With that, I would like to talk a little bit about how we got here. And these are the three reasons I believe contributed to how we have 3.6 million undocumented based Americans in this country. The first reason is Congress has failed to keep immigration policy in line with economic and political realities, not even capable of passing the least controversial elements of immigration reform, such as the DREAM Act, which I'll discuss a little bit more shortly. In fact, in his book, Immigration Outside the Law, Professor Montemurro states, quote, "History shows that the US economy has had a long and nearly insatiable desire for flexible, pliable, and inexpensive labor supplied by immigration, including undocumented immigrants." Second is the long history of racism against Latinos in the US. And I will also speak to the anti-immigrant sentiments that we have in this country. So I'll speak to each of these points as a context for how we got to this place. And then I will talk a little bit about my research. So the first point, the Development Relief and Education for Alien Minors Act, or the DREAM Act, was introduced in 2001 by Representative Gutierrez from Illinois and co-sponsored by Orrin Hatch and Dick Durbin. So it was a bipartisan bill. It almost passed in 2006 by Ted Kennedy and John McCain, who co-sponsored it then. But it has failed, and Congress has failed to pass it to this day. Political scientists Schneider and Ingram argue that there are reasons for this. They looked at 10 years of public policy and basically discovered or found that politicians act based on political opportunities. So strategically, they will pass public policies according to the social construction of groups by providing policy benefits for those who are constructed as advantaged members of society, such as the middle class, entrepreneurs, and providing policy burdens for those who are considered quote unquote deviant, such as people of color or immigrants. So according to their theory then, the DREAM Act would be considered a policy benefit to a group that has been considered a societal threat or constructed as a societal threat. And it would legalize millions of people. And this doesn't present a political opportunity for politicians. However, providing immigrants policy burdens does present a political opportunity. So what has happened instead, because of the inactions of Congress, we've seen the destruction of families due to high numbers of detentions and deportations, resulting in children being placed in foster care and over thousands of children missing either one or more of their parents due to deportations, which is considered, quote, collateral damage. And this doesn't even touch on the thousands of children who were systematically and intentionally separated from their parents at the border and locked in cages beginning in 2018. According to a recent New York Times article, Jeff Sessions was quoted as saying, "We need to take away the children, no matter how young." And this included infants who were still nursing. As Bill Ong-ing states in his book, Deporting Our Souls, the age of hysteria over immigration in which we live leads to tragic policies that challenge us as a moral society. Policies that are unnecessarily harsh, that show a dehumanizing side of our character are senseless. They bring shame to us as a civil society. These kinds of policy burdens could only happen because of the long-standing history of racism against Latinos. Take the Mexican origin Latino experience, which represents the majority of DACA recipients. We've experienced racism in the US since the war between the US and Mexico. Despite the option of citizenship with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, within just one generation, the use of the Spanish language, practices of Catholicism, and diverse combinations of indigenous and Spanish customs came under assault throughout the Southwest. So parallel and segregated societies were established, and discriminatory laws and practices became commonplace. There are so many examples of racism with material and societal consequences to this day. For example, we had restricted covenants were written into real estate transfers. Mexicans were not served at local businesses or allowed to be seen in town after sunset. For example, in California, the state passed an anti-vagrancy act actually called the Greaser Law, and it was specifically to restrict the movement of Mexicans, who were now technically Californians and Americans. So public space was defined as being white space. And finally, it wasn't uncommon for Mexican children who could not speak English to be placed in classrooms for the mentally disabled. And many schools just flat out denied Mexican children more than an elementary education, using scientific racism arguments that they were inferior and should not be mixing in the same school with whites. We still feel the consequences of this open discrimination. For example, political scientist Bianco and Cannon state, currently 79% of Latino students still attend segregated schools. There's unequal economic opportunities, which has resulted in our current wealth gap. According to the Pew Research Center, white wealth is 10 times greater than for Latinos. And Ward and Rivera argue in their book, Institutional Racism, Organizations and Public Policy, that the confinement of Mexicans to guest worker status and, quote, government-sanctioned housing discrimination has lingering effects to the present. So Latinos have been forced to live in conditions of poverty and segregation, and then we're blamed for society's problems, ranging from crime to communicable diseases. We've also been the targets of motivated racial violence. For example, in Latino Peoples in the New Americas, scholars Kerrigan and Webb document the lynching of Latinos by white mobs in the Southwest. And so many people don't even know about this story or these experiences. Using official records that recorded the alleged crimes of Latinos who were lynched included the usual charges of murder, theft, sexual assault, but the records also included entries such as, quote, mistaken for abandoned, or, quote, being a desperate character, or, quote, pursuing legal action against a friend of the mob. This was actually put in the records because they didn't feel they even needed to cover up the easy way that our lives were dispensable. One case in particular became a tipping point for the Latino community to fight back. The authors state, quote, in 1911, Antonio Gomez, a 14-year-old boy, was arrested for alleged murder in Thorndale, Texas. Gomez was seized by a mob of over 100 people, this is a 14-year-old, who hanged him and then dragged his corpse throughout the streets of the town, close quote. So this racist violence against Latinos has included killing young teenagers and children throughout our history. 14-year-old Antonio Gomez was our Emmett Till, only this history isn't as widely known. We've been the targets of hate crimes and racial violence for a very long time. In fact, on August 3rd, 2019, a gunman specifically targeting Latinos shot and killed 23 people and injured many others in El Paso, Texas. The youngest one was 15 years old. His name was Javier Rodriguez, and he was a soccer athlete and a student, and he was murdered because he was Latino. My oldest son is 15. This could have been him gunned down because the hatred many Americans feel about us runs very deep. However, I want to be very clear. This racism goes beyond individuals and can be linked directly to US government policies and practices in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean. And some of those practices include labor practices. So despite contemporary ahistorical accounts that we are invading America, the continued migration of Latinos in the US includes the US's dependence on our labor for generations. This is one picture of an example of the Bracero program. My grandfathers on both sides of my family were part of this system of cheap labor known as braceros. It was a documented guest worker program. The Bracero program started after during World War II with the labor shortage, but it went until 1965, and it's estimated that about 5 million workers from Mexico were brought into the US to provide labor in 24 states over the course of this program. The US dependence on Mexican labor continues to this day and has expanded from agriculture to exploitation in the meatpacking industry and the construction industries, as political scientist Paul Apostolides documents in his book, Breaks in the Chain. And for an example of what happens when we're blamed for economic downfalls, during the Great Depression between 1929 and 1939, it's estimated that 500,000 Latinos were literally rounded up and sent to Mexico under the quote unquote repatriation program. It's estimated, scholars estimate that about 60% of those sent back were US citizens. And it makes sense because the parents were sent back and their children who were born here, thanks to the 14th Amendment, were sent back with them. So these are examples of how Latinos have been scapegoats for the US's economic difficulties for a very long time. We've been treated as a source of cheap, dispensable, racially inferior, and temporary labor, and we've suffered a lot because of this. Our opportunities have been stifled, and we've had intergenerational trauma, in my family for sure, but in countless Latino families for decades. And Latinos have experienced this in the US for over 100 years now. It has created what Professor Leo Chavez calls the Latino threat narrative, and it's currently being promoted by politicians, the media, and many others to this day. President Trump's racist message about Latinos as rapists and criminals are old and familiar tropes about us. In How Race is Made in America, historian Natalia Molina calls these types of stereotypes racial scripts because they can be reused and understood in the next generation or even in the next debate, she states. Molina argues that racial scripts are created and retold to discriminate against certain groups in the US and are very powerful because most people understand exactly what they mean, and they perpetuate negative stereotypes. She states racial scripts serve as a means of embedding racist attitudes into laws, policies, and institutions. My final point about how we got to this position is the history of hostility towards immigrants. Since the birth of the Republic, Americans have had a dualistic sentiment regarding immigrants. One can be found in Benjamin Franklin's xenophobia regarding German immigrants, and the other can be found in George Washington's proclamation that America was to be home, quote, for the persecuted of the earth. And while historians may debate whether Washington's proclamation would include us, this is besides the point. These two perspectives, represented by two of the nation's framers, have been at the heart of the immigration debate from the beginning. Historian May Nagay traces this development and major problems in American history, immigration history. And according to her, nativism has extended to Russians, Chinese, Germans, Mexicans, and many other groups. Indeed, this sentiment was even extended to Native American tribes. Professor Nagay shows that many groups that did not enjoy the opportunity to, quote, assimilate into American society because of a combination of exclusionary laws and actions of an often openly xenophobic citizenry. So, for example, the Naturalization Act that spanned from 1790 to 1950, most of those acts included white person as a prerequisite for naturalization. So almost until the 1950s, basic laws of citizenship didn't apply to racialized groups. So while many European groups have also confronted hostility from the citizenry, particularly Southern and Eastern Europeans, They've never faced the kind of legal racial restrictions on naturalization experienced by people of color. And the consequences of these exclusionary laws remain with us to this day in the form of DACA recipients who have grown up in this country. So in sum, this brief context explains why I believe we have 3.6 million youth raised in America without legal rights or recognition, living in a state of permanent disadvantage regarding work experiences, educational opportunities, or even something as basic as family unity and security. It was in this context that President Obama established DACA. And his argument can be found in his statement at the Rose Garden, where he said, quote, "It makes no sense to expel talented young people who for all intents and purposes are Americans. They've been raised as Americans, understand themselves to be part of this country. To expel these young people who want to staff our labs, start new businesses, or defend our country simply because of the actions of their parents or the inactions of politicians," close quote. But DACA was never meant to provide a change in legal status. All it provided was protection and security for undocumented immigrants, protection from deportation, and the ability to work. And it was supposed to be renewed every 2 years. So again, it did not provide a path to citizenship for recipients, nor fundamentally address their legal status. They remain undocumented. In addition, DACA only ever protected a small group of dreamers, as Wendy will share in her remarks. In fact, some studies have found that only a minority of the dreamer population, about over 600,000, are currently protected under DACA. And even at the height of DACA, only about 800,000 were protected. It should be noted that DACA recipients are from all over the world. However, 80% of them were born in Mexico. So in this context, my co-authors and I investigated how growing up undocumented impacts one's life goals, education, political identities, just what does it mean to grow up in a country where you don't have the same legal rights and representation as even your siblings do? So what we did was we hired fabulous research assistants like Wendy, and we explored a number of areas. And similar to national data, we found that the average age of arrival to the US by our sample was 7 years old. And 70% of them, again, very similar to national data, live in mixed status households, meaning some people in their family are documented and some people are not. So we also found that some could no longer speak Spanish, and many don't even know relatives in the country of their birth. Instead, these respondents we interviewed were raised and socialized in the US for the majority of their lives, attending public schools and living immersed in American culture. However, the US government and society do not accept them as legitimate members because they lack the proper documents. Consequently, they watch their American friends and even members of their own families, due to the high percentages of mixed status families, such as their brothers and sisters, they watch them apply for driver's licenses or for college or for scholarships or study away, all on the sidelines because of what one person we interviewed called, they lacked the privilege of the 9-digit number. Our respondents, and currently over 3 million people, cannot participate in many of the conventional socializing processes of adulthood in the US. And these experiences leave them feeling resentful and with a lack of hope, particularly now as President Trump has unsuccessfully challenged to end DACA. So I'm just going to briefly underscore some of those frustrations these undocumented youth expressed before turning it over to Wendy, who will discuss her actual experiences in living in this status. The first is always living in fear. As Hector says, there's always the fear of deportation, the fear of being ripped away from your family, your school, your friends, everything you've ever known, especially if you've been here at such a young age. It's really daunting and quite terrifying. Most of the Latino youth we interviewed felt that they were just living in limbo as they continue to live in the US without a clear path to becoming legal, permanent residents, or even citizens. Many have grown cynical about the intent behind DACA and feel manipulated by the nature of these symbolic politics, so often associated with the public debate regarding immigration. As Enrique's quote states, "We're living in the moment, we're living day by day. You know, you may get deported next year, you may get deported in 5 years. How can you plan, or how can you make a plan for your life if you don't know where you're going to be?" We found that many of the undocumented youth we interviewed have grown up in America, and some weren't even aware of their legal status until they had to provide papers for, driver's licenses or college applications. So they really saw themselves as legitimate members of society, as Americans. So it should come as no surprise to see them engage in political activism, protesting for their rights as Americans. The perspectives shared in the interviews provide important insights into how they form their identity and also into the undocumented and unafraid movement that they started, as they very much see themselves as US citizens. Despite this, there's the fear and uncertainty reflected in these words, which underscore the complexities of the situation. With DACA, they were being asked to take a leap of faith in submitting their application to the government. And Wendy, again, will speak more to this, but I remember her asking me when she was at my RA if she should apply, because right before we were gonna send out the survey for this book and do interviews, that's when DACA was announced by Obama. And at the time that she was my RA, I told her, if you were my daughter, I'd tell you to wait until after the election because one never knows. And it's actually worse now. But anyway, these young people had to trust the government enough to be willing to provide all of their personal information while living in the US with undocumented family members. They had to trust the government because they had no other option. Despite the overall sense that DACA falls short of a substantive public policy solution, our respondents provided a laundry list of major and minor life changes for them with DACA, including being able to drive without the fear of deportation, going to college and then being able to work in their field of study, feeling equal and or safer, being able to travel freely, being able to work legally and for fair wages, being able to apply for academic scholarships, being able to even do something as basic as being in a romantic relationship without being suspected of being in the partnership for papers. So the capacity to have a full social life and contribute to society was something that was given to them with DACA, even though, and the list goes on, even though it wasn't a permanent solution. As one undocumented young woman interviewed for my book stated, "We are members of this society, whether people acknowledge it or not, but we continue to be discriminated against, marginalized, and othered. We experience rejection on a daily basis. And although we continue to overcome barrier after barrier, it is not a way of life that any person should have to experience. We're talented individuals who want to be able to give back to our communities. Why does legislation continue to prevent us from doing so? Why let our skills go to waste? Why not use them to improve this nation? This problem is much bigger than people want to acknowledge." She states, "We're human beings who deserve to be treated with respect and dignity." And this quote is from my former RA, Wendy Martinez Hurtado, who's now a second-year law student at the University of Washington and was brought to the US at the age of 7, like so many others. So with this context, I'd like to now turn it over to this amazing young woman. Wendy?
Wow, I've never been introduced with a quote before. That's a first one for me. Before starting, if folks have questions, please submit them. I think it's really great that you all have joined us for this conversation today. I wish it wasn't a webinar. I wish it was a Zoom call so that we could have that back and forth, because I do think that this conversation, really deserves like the space and time to be in dialogue with each other. So again, thank you so much, Professor Chavez, for setting the context for this crucial conversation and allowing me to be a part of it today. Before I continue, I'd like to start by sharing a little bit about myself and my immigration story. But first, I'd like to acknowledge that my experience is just one of many within the DACA population. And as stated before, we come from all over the world. I am the granddaughter of a young man who entered the US as part of the Betrayal program. I am the daughter of a man who at the age of 13 began joining his father across the US-Mexico border to work in the fields of California to support their family. I am the daughter of a woman who fearlessly decided that her daughters would not grow up without a father, starting that journey across the US-Mexico border to Washington. I am the living legacy of the many family members that have died, suffered, and crossed the border towards the American dream. I proudly identify as Mexican, undocumented, unafraid, woman of color, who is human, who is worthy. I didn't always identify myself this way. I questioned my value, the power of my story, the power of my voice, my sense of belonging. And I'd say some of those sentiments were true even when I was an undergrad student at PLU. However, my journey has demonstrated that my existence, that my story, that my voice matters, that they're powerful, and that they can create positive changes for myself and others. I carry the vivid memories of my journey across the US-Mexico border, the beginning of my life in the United States, the constant fear and uncertainty that being a DACA beneficiary comes with, and lastly, the overwhelming responsibility to match my parents' sacrifice with worthy accomplishment. And I can say, because I've been in community with so many other folks that have benefited from DACA, that these are sentiments that a lot of us share in common. My family and I migrated to the United States when I was 7 years old. And at this point, my life changed forever. Before this happening, as a 7-year-old, my biggest dream was being able to live in the same household as my dad. But what I didn't realize at that point in time, that this was really going to change everything about my life, that way I was going to navigate moving forward. I distinctly remember coming home from first grade and crying myself to sleep. I missed my home, I missed my family, I missed my friends. I felt ashamed by the language barrier I faced and felt humiliated every time my classmates laughed at the accent I didn't realize I had. Growing up, I wanted to make up for all of these internalized shortcomings that really are a result of the immigration system. This drove me to succeed in school. I learned English in months. And often rewarded for my accomplishments. I never missed a day of school. I was a 4.0 student. I tried to exceed really in every aspect of my life. I was praised for my leadership, my grades, my commitment to community. But in the midst of all this, what I wasn't realizing is that I was assimilating into the mainstream US society. And as a result, was really erasing crucial parts of my identity, who I was, my cultural roots, where I came from, a lot of things that have taken 20 years to kind of recover due to being undocumented and what this journey has been in the US. Between the struggles of fitting in, the ongoing dehumanizing narratives on media, and the constant reminders of the disposability of people who identify like me, every day feels like a fight and a reminder of the pains of immigration and the challenges of my family, and the experiences they experience on a daily day. But ultimately, what this has taught me is how powerful and resistant the immigrant community is, how young undocumented folks have continued to make history by transforming the narrative, shifting power, and making state and federal policies like WASFA and DACA possible. In 2010, when I started my college journey at PLU, neither programs existed. For folks that know me, I often share a story about my dream school and trying to get into it. And to make that long story short, I was rejected. And the main reason they offered was because I was undocumented and they didn't want to take a risk on me. Because accepting me would mean that they would need to finance my college education. And that's just something they said they wouldn't risk. On the other side, I had PLU give me a huge opportunity. They were willing to accept my application with the scholarship. And I am extremely grateful for that opportunity, but I also had to call PLU out. It failed me in so many different ways. Faculty, staff, students were vocal about what they thought about my presence at PLU. I can't recall the many times I heard, "I can't believe PLU accepts students like her. Why would PLU fund a student like her? Why isn't PLU funding US citizens?" Some folks did so cowardly through notes posted on my door, and others did so publicly every time I participated in a panel discussion. I'd lie if I said that first year at PLU wasn't tough, wasn't hard. I probably cried too many times. But in the midst of it, I also found there was this fire that lit in me. I wanted to ensure that other students that identified as undocumented didn't have to experience some of the things that I experienced by being labeled the first undocumented student on campus. I see on this call that there are some professors that I had during my time at PLU, and I don't know how many of you all remember, but there was this article that was part of the PLU newspaper where it had this like huge spread of the number of applicants, the number of folks accepted to PLU, and then there was this huge one that said one undocumented student on campus. It didn't reference me by name, but very quickly folks found out who I was. And I think when I shared that folks posted really mean notes on my dorm room door, I think a part of it resulted from this newspaper article. And I'd also have to say that that newspaper article was wrong. I might have been one of the first undocumented students on campus. I started being pretty vocal very early on, but there were other folks. And I think I share that to say, I think folks were not wanting to disclose their status because they understood that the environment at PLU wasn't as friendly as we think or as like PLU said it was. At that point in time, I started talking to professors and other students. I tried to share my story every time I had the opportunity to do so. I connected with incoming students, and it's really incredible to see some of the changes that have happened at PLU in the last decade with the Gold Group, the task force, the website, the funding resources. But that was just not the setup that PLU had when I was a PLU student or undergrad student at PLU. While Obama is often credited for the implementation of DACA, let us be clear, DACA was implemented only after the pressure he experienced from thousands of undocumented young folks organizing across the nation, notably United We Dream, which is a nonprofit organization staffed by undocumented young people and professionals. For those who identify as DACA, June 15, 2012 is really a date that a lot of us remember. We remember that a promise was made to us that we wouldn't be deported, that we'd have the opportunity to apply for a work permit. And this felt like a huge win within the undocumented community. But I think what often is missed in the conversation is talking about the social, legal, and financial challenges that came with this program. First, there was this huge hurdle around, are we eligible? Are we individually eligible for this program? Do we meet all the criteria? Do we have the documentation that they're requesting from us? I think I ended up being in the portion of folks who were, I would identify as like lucky because we're still in the education system. So getting school records was relatively easy. But I often think about the folks that were already in their 30s at that time that this program was implemented, because what they had to do was go back, 12 years, 15 years, to try to get their school records. And one of the things we quickly found out was that there are some school districts that delete all of their information after 10 years. So we had, those who are eligible, we had to find records that sometimes they didn't even exist anymore. So let's say folks were able to meet all the requirements and were able to get all the information together. For a lot of us, this was a time and space where we had to ask ourselves, are we putting our families in danger? We're having to add information of every place we've lived. All the information that could probably trace back to our parents, our loved ones. So let's say, again, that was another hurdle. A third hurdle was figuring out legal assistance to complete the application. I don't know how many of you all have spent time with immigration-related documents, but these forms are not super straightforward. And so thinking about completing the application, thinking about the application fee, at that point in time, it was a new program. A lot of us didn't know what to do with it. But what was happening in like the legal world was that some firms were charging up to $2,000 to complete this application. And then, so if you can imagine $2,000 plus about $500 to apply for the application, that's a big chunk of money, which often was multiplied because many of us live in households where there's multiple folks that benefited from DACA. And so again, I've already talked about kind of like the financial hurdle. But what's happened in the midst of all this was that there were fee increases. So I think we're talking about eligibility, we're talking about the application fee, the financial resources we needed to access, the legal resources we needed to access. And so for folks that were able to get to that end goal, now we sent this off to USCIS. We sent it off to an agency that could come back and I think, or something to note is that this program was discretionary from the beginning. So there was no guarantee that we would be approved. We also had to go do biometrics. Going into the office, this USCIS office, we didn't really know we were going to come back out because again, all of this was discretionary. In 2013, like Maria shared, I actually was one of the folks that waited because I didn't really know if I wanted to apply to this program. I wanted to kind of think about the risks and the benefits. So I checked in with mentors. I had long conversations with my parents. And again, I was thinking through all the questions that I imagined so many other young folks were also asking themselves, in particular, whether our parents would be targeted. And many chose to not apply. And so if we go back to some of the numbers that Professor Chavez was sharing, there were a lot more that could potentially be eligible. But at the peak of this program, only about 800,000 folks applied. And as you can imagine, some of these hurdles were the reasons why they ended up not applying. At this point, I remember very distinctly a conversation I had with my mom, and I will remember those words, and I wanted to share them with you all. But during one of the times we sat down to talk as to whether I would be applying, she said, "If I have to be deported for you to follow your dreams, that is the risk I'm willing to take." I applied for DACA because of my mom's courage. But that fear was definitely in the back of my mind. So again, the program was implemented 2012. I applied 2013. If I had enough time to talk about what happened between 2014 and 2020, we'd be here for more than 1 hour, and we don't have time for that. So very quickly, if in 2014, the program, there was the hope that we could expand the program to take some of those age limitations off. DAPA was introduced, a program that would have supported parents with US children. None of those things went through. A lot of the legislation that was happening at that point in time was whether DACA was even a legal program. In 2012, we had a memo that came out from USCIS talking about rescinding the program. And at that point in time, between the time that the memo came out and the time that they said no more applications, they only gave folks 1 month. And so if we talk about those initial hurdles, folks that had the opportunity to renew had to kind of pull all those resources within a very limited time. Fast forward to 2020, the Supreme Court decision. I'd wake up, I know this was shared earlier that I'm a law student. So I want to say that for about 2 months, because we didn't really know when the decision would come out, we understood that the Supreme Court had decision days. So they could come out on Mondays, they could come out on Thursdays. So for about 2 months, all I was doing was waking up really early those 2 days to just kind of see if the decision would come out. I don't know about you all, but it's not even the waking up early part, but it's the uncertainty that came with opening like the link and clicking on it and figuring out if I was going to get bad news, good news, no news. On June 18th, that news finally came out. I can't count, but the entire day I received texts, I received emails, I received calls. A lot of these calls were to congratulate me, which I felt like I understood the sentiments of allies. I understood the sentiments of friends, or at least I attempted to understand that they were happy that this program would, in a sense, continue. But to be honest, all I felt that day was anger. I was angry. I was holding a number of different emotions in my body. And part of it was, I didn't exactly know. I think at that point in time, we kind of understood that the program was going to continue. But I think the more I looked into it, what actually happened is that the Supreme Court decision actually was a recipe. It was a recipe telling Trump and telling the Department of Homeland Security that they actually hadn't followed the correct steps to take the program away. And so as much as I wanted to feel like this was a win for the community, I'd ask for you all to think about the fact that it was a win, but it also came with additional uncertainty. This program, again, can be pulled at any moment. Many of us tried to submit our applications in the month of June because we understood that this decision would come out. Both my sister and I applied. I've always sent our applications together. And I'm so grateful that she actually received hers, and she received it for a 2-year time. I'm still waiting on mine. And so I think when we think about how this Supreme Court decision is impacting folks, it's having different results within families, right? Like, I'm so grateful that my sister gets to have that work permit for 2 more years. I'm still waiting on mine. I don't know if I'll get it. I don't know if I'll get a 1 year as they're supposed to be issued at this point. I don't know if I won't get it before a decision comes out that the program is actually going to be removed for good. And this is, I think, for a lot of us, we're just kind of holding our breath and waiting to see what happens. Now, the 2020 elections. The 2020 elections, this time and space is really taking me to a space where I was 4 years ago, on the night of the election day. I was in Seattle because I was supporting with a work event. I not remember the name of the hotel, but it's like this fancy hotel in downtown Seattle. There were politicians there, there were recognized organizers, and we had this huge screen to see as the numbers were coming in. And I think at first, folks were drinking. I think there was some celebration. I think a lot of us were hopeful. But as soon as those numbers started to come in, we very quickly realized that things weren't looking so good. And at that point in time, I remember checking in with with the executive director and being like, I gotta go home. I gotta be with my family. I got on the bus, went down to Tacoma to see my parents. And we didn't really say much to each other, but we hugged, right? We hugged because we understood the implications of the new, at that point, the new potential president, who we knew had won the elections. That following morning, I received a text from my executive director telling me, hey, Wendy, like, I understand that the news was probably hard for you and your family. Take a few days, just like be with your family if you need to be. And at that same time, I actually could hear my mom getting up, getting ready for work. This was about like 6 a.m. in the morning. And I go out and again, the only thing we do is hug each other. But in the back of my mind, I was like, my mom is getting up to go to work, to do the things she's done for the last 20 years, to support my sister, to support me, to support our dreams, to support the goals and dreams that she had for her daughters. And I remember I decided to not take the day. I decided to go into work. And as I reached the office in Seattle, they were like, hey, they're looking for folks to speak. Are you willing just to like share a little bit about your experience? I actually had initially said no. I often am someone that tries really hard to uplift other voices. But for the folks that I had reached out to, they just weren't in the right mindset. And it was either me speaking or not have an undocumented voice. And I decided to step up. And I think I decided to step up more so because I like in the midst of all the different identities that I have, I very much recognize the privileges that I hold within me, right? Like I am English speaking, I'm able-bodied, and the list goes on and on and on. And so I really wanted to use my voice, and I decided to speak that day and share a similar message with you all today, right? I think we all have the opportunity to really step up during the elections that are happening in a few weeks. We need to recognize our own privilege. We need to show up for folks that aren't able to vote at this point in time. And I imagine if, well, I don't imagine, I actually know for a fact that many of you probably have an undocumented student, or have undocumented friends, or have undocumented folks in your communities. And today, on their behalf, on our behalf, I really push you to really take your privilege and do the things that need to be done at this point in time, whether it's voting, whether it's ensuring that our communities are as safe as possible, and understand the implications of not taking action at this point in time, because it's crucial. A lot of our lives are really depending on that today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. It's so important to learn about these experiences, not just from the academic perspective, but from the people who actually go through it and live it every day. And as we know, the stakes can be higher during this election. This presidential administration has included separating children from their parents at the border, shutting down the government over funding over a border wall, and failed efforts to end DACA, thereby ending protections against young immigrants like Wendy from deportation. I shouldn't even call her an immigrant, she's an American. So if President Trump gets reelected, he will keep trying. When the Supreme Court stopped his first attempt to terminate DACA in 2017, President Trump tweeted, quote, "We'll be submitting enhanced papers shortly in order to properly fulfill the Supreme Court's ruling and requests of yesterday." According to the New York Times, Kenneth Cuccinelli, Deputy Secretary at DHS, tweeted back right away, "We're on it, Mr. President." In contrast, former Vice President Joe Biden states in his plan for securing our values as a nation of immigrants that if elected, in the first 100 days of his administration, he will stop the separating of children from their parents at the border, and he will protect dreamers and their families. However, we also know that there are a lot of efforts to suppress the vote in many states. I mean, honestly, looking at this picture, do you think you'd be more likely to vote if you had to stand in the sun for 10 minutes or for 6 hours? So we've had calls from the president to ask private citizens to go out and watch polling places, or stating mail-in ballots will be fraudulent without any evidence. And so we can, despite these things, resist the current trajectory our nation is on regarding immigration and more broadly regarding race relations. However, it's not going to be easy. Political scientist Bernard Fraga argues in his book, The Turnout Gap, that the underrepresentation of people of color in elections and the overrepresentation of whites will only worsen as the nation becomes more diverse. He argues that it's the job of politicians, whether white or people of color, to run campaigns in ways that mobilize more minority voters. Similarly, political scientist Davin Phoenix argues in his book, The Anger Gap, that people of color, specifically African Americans, although he does have a chapter on Latinos and Asian Americans, he argues we don't turn our political anger and frustration into electoral participation the way whites do. So while the 2020 elections have tremendous implications, not only for DACA and recipients, but for all the rest of us interested in a healthy multiracial democracy, we must really understand what these implications are. And we must currently stand up to the racism and backlash against immigrants and people of color, because honestly, we're in this country together. So as the nation becomes increasingly diverse, we must ask ourselves, what does the continual denial of citizenship and full participation to American-raised youth say about us as a nation? Clearly, this situation falls short of our stated ideals as a country. In fact, that DACA recipients is largely made up of Latinos only makes the situation worse, in my opinion. The demographics of the US are changing rapidly, with Latinos representing close to 20% of the US population. And as political scientist Ron Schmidt argues, if we want a healthy democracy in the future, it must be an ethno-racial democracy, an inclusive ethno-racial democracy. 2, if enough of us vote, there's a stronger chance that Congress will finally have the capacity and the will to pass reasonable immigration reform, benefiting not only DACA recipients, but the future of this country as well. This election will determine the fate of DACA recipients who have been living in limbo for decades. And 3, maybe, just maybe, despite our anti-immigrant, anti-Latino history, we are finally at a moment in this society where we can begin to view Latinos as part of this country and not just as dispensable laborers, outsiders, or criminals. The outcome of this election will determine the path we choose. Based on the multiracial protests against police brutality we've witnessed across the country, I believe there are enough people of all backgrounds who want to make America live up to her ideals. So this starts with voting. As former civil rights leader and Representative John Lewis stated in the 2016 election, we've come too far, we've made too much progress, and we're not going back, we're going forward. That's why we all must go to the polls in November and vote like we never, ever voted before. Thank you. Please submit your questions, if you have any. I see we do have one question, and please, other people, go ahead. Dr. Tamara Williams says, what measures do you think PLU should be taking in addition to the Gold Group webpage and continued training of faculty and staff to support and protect DACA and undocumented students against President Trump being reelected? Do you want to answer that, Wendy, or what more can PLU do?
Yeah, this is thank you for the question. I think it's a really important one to ask. I often think that when things like this happen, when something changes in policy, often what I see schools doing in particular are just like support statements, which I do think are beneficial to some degree, but it's really about understanding the population. And I feel like this feels like a hard question for me because I was a PLU undocumented student in 2010 through 2014, which felt very different than the environment that the folks are in today and just what they're experiencing. But I know that one of the things that would have been helpful to me at that point in time would have been like, to understand who exactly I needed to go to if something was happening, if something had happened to a family member. And I know PLU has had like sessions with immigration attorneys. But I think for me, I guess I'd say ensuring that there is a clear plan to support students that might experience some retaliation, or if the program goes away, what does that look like? Oh, this is a hard question, and I don't know how to best answer it. I feel like I have examples coming to mind. One, I think I think I was super grateful for the experience of being a research assistant for Professor Chavez. But if you remember, one of the challenges we had at that point in time was like, how do I participate when all the other research assistants were getting paid? And I think we got creative, right? We were like,
We got creative. My husband's an attorney and he said, don't leave a paper trail. Whatever you do, don't leave a paper trail.
yeah, and you were like, hey, let's get you college credit or a class credit, or let's get you, I think we worked out a few other benefits, but I think it's about getting creative, right? Thinking about the circumstances that folks will be at that point in time. So if this program is removed, folks might not be able to work. And I would even say, like, there are current students that don't have DACA and aren't able to work on campus, right? And so what other opportunities are you giving them financially to like be able to fully engage on campus? And so I think that's like financial support, legal support, making sure that all of the students that identify as undocumented have had at least a consultation with an immigration attorney, and being able to set that up. I think emotionally, I think when we talk about mental health concerns have increased in the last decade for undocumented folks. And many of us, just because of the stigma of like seeing a therapist or like what that looks like within our own communities, making sure that folks have access to mental health resources that could have someone that understands the issue and understands the population, I think is really important. And I'm not sure if PLU or other institutions are providing like that of a specific support.
So there's another question from Russ Lidman. Wendy mentioned potential DACA participants didn't apply for the program. Do you know what the current circumstances are today? Do you know whether people are applying, Wendy, or afraid of applying, or given the context of the Trump administration are waiting for the election? Do you know what's going on?
I would say that folks in like the legal world, folks are being encouraged to renew. Initial applicants from back in 2017 when it was first rescinded, new applicants aren't able to apply at all. But for folks that had the their DACA had received it, had been approved, we've been able to renew. And I would say the folks that have been able to access legal resources, financial resources, are able to apply. Because again, I think before the Supreme Court decision, it was pretty scary. We didn't know what was happening. So there was a push to get folks to apply. At this point in time, folks are applying, but they're only getting a 1-year work permit. And there's a lot of complications that come with that.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, it's 1 o'clock or 1 minute to 1, and to respect everyone's time, this is a conversation that could continue. And thank you all so very much for taking time out of your afternoon on a Friday to join us. Again, going back to this election, we have to stand up to this current racism and backlash against people of color and immigrants, and against our democracy, to be frank. So hopefully you will all participate in this election. And again, thank you so very much for joining us. Bye.
And I see that last question. What is the message for undergraduate undocumented students at PLU and elsewhere? I would say there's so many of us that are here for you. I hope you have found community on your campus. I would say like there is a handful of really amazing staff and faculty at PLU, and so making sure you're connected with those folks. But I think the real message is we're here for you. We're like fighting, and there is an organizing community that's here to back you up. And so sending a lot of love to the current undocumented students at PLU and elsewhere.
Thank you. Bye.